Welcome to another episode. This is a video series where I'm editing a photo from start to finish so you can see my entire editing workflow. Today we're gonna edit this picture. I shot this last summer with my buddy playing drums and I wanted to have a very dynamic feel to it and have colors that would look like it was shot on film. Probably more like it's part of a music video, so let's keep that in mind and let's jump into Lightroom. But before I start, this is me from the future. I got a bit of a disclaimer. This video ended up being a bit slower paced, but on the other side, I'm showing you the real process, the way that I actually edit the photos and the mistakes that I'm doing along the way, because let's be honest, nobody knows exactly what slider to pull on, and you're gonna see me failing at a few things and then finding out what the right method is. So let me know in the comments down below if you prefer this style or what I did before where I actually cut those parts out. And now let's start the actual video. I shot this one on a GoPro Hero 9 and this weird flare over here is because I had some moisture trapped behind the lens. But I really love the effect and I think I have a video that I'll link somewhere around here. Now let's turn our focus to exposure and actually editing the photo. I'm going to start by checking remove chromatic aberration. I'm also going to apply a color response curve based on, let's say, color 200, just because GoPro color profiles are way too contrasty and saturated. Drop down the contrast massively. And now I'm going to raise the blacks quite significantly since I shot this against the sun. I'm also going to boost up the shadows a bit, but not too much. I don't want the photo to look HDR. I'm going to drop down the highlights just a tiny bit and maybe increase the whites, but not too much because the sun is in frame and it's already clipping. Now, with that already applied, I'm gonna apply the color response curve of Kodak 2383, but I'm gonna do it in a mask and I have a preset for that around here. And I'm trying to figure out if I want the D60 or the D55 version, but I think D60 is more interesting with these greens in the foreground. And I'm also going to increase the exposure just a tiny bit to get more out of this photo. My subject is still underexposed and we're gonna fix that with a mask, but before doing that, I'm gonna apply a visual helper. This is a preset that I'm selling on my website, and what it does, it's applying a mask on top of the entire photo so you can better see just the exposure. And I'm gonna use masking and go for select subject, intersect that with a radial gradient, and increase the exposure just on my subject a bit, trying to mimic that the sun is hitting the symbol over here and reflecting some light into his face. And I'm trying to be somewhat subtle about it. I'm also going to increase the highlights on his face and drop the shadows a bit to get more contrast. Also, I'm going to use another radial gradient coming from the upper part of the image and increase the exposure a bit more because I feel the sky is a bit too dark. Let's turn off the visual helper. And this is already much better. Now I want another mask to deal a bit with the sun that's blowing out. And what I'm gonna do is increase the exposure around it so the clipping is not that obvious. And I'm also going to drop the clarity and maybe even the sharpness around that area. We don't need details in a sun flare. Also, the white balance in this shot is kinda wacky, probably a bit too much green reflecting from the grass. So let's see what happens if I increase the tint. And I like where this is going. Also, in terms of white balance, let's make it just a tiny bit warmer, but I'm not gonna push it too far because I'm pretty sure I'm gonna push some of this green into yellow as well. Now, another thing that bothers me with this composition is the houses over here, which are not that aesthetic. So I'm gonna use the AI remove thingy. Let's see if it does a good job or if it mangles everything up. Half decent job. Let's see what it does without AI enabled. Maybe just the old classic content aware would do a bit of a better job. Not great, not terrible. I'll enable AI again and go for the rest of the houses. Maybe, just maybe, it will actually do a good thing now. but I don't have much trust into it. I think that's good enough. Maybe I'll clone stamp some more before the end, but for now, that is good enough. Oh, and this is even better. This is perfect. I'll leave it like this for now. The next thing that I want to focus my attention is grain, and I'm gonna use the all-in-one grain preset, which applies more grain to the shadows and less to the midtones. I'm gonna go pretty heavy on this one. I think I'm gonna go for the 800 preset. I wanted to drop the sharpness quite significantly. Since this was shot on a GoPro, I know it has way too many details that are not really well captured. So grain 800 it is. And also because it's shot on a GoPro, it has all this distortion. And let's see if a bit of distortion control actually helps. I don't like how little sky I have over here left, but that means that I can crop a bit more to balance the frame out. Maybe even more. Think I'm getting close to the 16:9 that I actually wanted. Let's see. Can I actually go for 16:9? Still nope. Way too tight. But this has potential. Maybe a bit less distortion control and a bit of transform to level things out, because it felt like the entire image was skewing towards the right side. So also maybe just a tiny bit like this. I think this is much better. And with the basic adjustments kinda done, I wanna focus my attention on masking. I wanna shape the entire photo so the attention of the viewer goes toward the middle, and for that I have to get rid of some of the details in the foreground. So I'm gonna start with a radial gradient that's starting from outside the frame, going into it. Over here, I'm gonna slightly drop the exposure to give the impression there is way more shadow. Another mask that I'm gonna do is gonna be a brush mask. For this one, I wanna eliminate the shadow areas in this lighter zone on the right. I think they're creating a bit too much of a distraction. So I'm gonna intersect the brush mask with a bit of a luminance range. Select this darker spot over here, and I'm just going to drop the contrast. Refine my luminance range a bit because it's taking too much of the highlights, and I'm going to increase the highlights a bit more. So let's see before and after for this mask. I think it's blending in much better with the highlights of the flare, and it's distracting a bit less. And actually, let's modify the shape of this mask over here. I think it's way too broad, and I want the highlights on the right side to come towards the edge of the frame. So I'm gonna decrease the size, move it a bit to the left, and maybe also push down the highlights just a bit. And I also want a bit more grain in this foreground over here to cover up some of the details. So another radial gradient, pretty big and broad. And I'm just gonna add a bit more grain over here. I wanna make it look like it's a film that's been pushed quite significantly. So tons of grain in the shadows will get me that look. Maybe even adjust the grain in the shadows as well. Boost it up just a tiny bit more. And speaking of grain, I want to reduce it around the face just a bit, because I feel that I'm losing too many details. And finally, to balance the picture out, I think I want the highlights on the left accentuated just a tiny bit. So I'll grab a brush mask and add a few strokes on the left, something like this, without this air over here. Just something subtle, and I'm going to increase the exposure slightly just to have those highlights pop. And let's see if my skill is good enough to accentuate the flare as well. I think I overdid it there. So let's use the eraser and tone it down just a bit. And I think that's pretty much all the masking. Maybe I'm going to tone this down a bit more using the amount slider, because in fairness, I don't want exposure to be increased. I want the whites and the highlights to go up. I want a bit of contrast there, just for artistic effect. And now I want to focus my attention on the colors in the photo. So what I'm gonna start with is adding a bit of vibrance, and what I really want is some reddish tones in the midtones, and I'm gonna start by doing that in the color grading panel. That's a bit too much. Let's tone it down. Probably something like saturation 10 is good enough. And while we are here, we're gonna completely ignore the fact that sometimes in between takes, I raise the exposure in the yellow and green channel significantly to get more luminance in the grass. So yeah, that happened somewhere in the edit, but I forgot to mention it. Going back to my colors, I think that I want just a tiny bit of cyan in my highlights. I like to keep it rather subtle, probably around 10 saturation, and a bit of luminance increase maybe, just a tiny bit. And while we're here, I'm also going to add a bit of green in the shadows, mostly for the foreground over here. All of these are really subtle, plus 6 saturation in the shadows, plus 10 in the midtones, and plus 10 in the highlights, which I'm going to pull more towards blue or more towards green. Let's see. I like it more around green, so that's about it. And to clear out some of the yellowness in the sky, I'm gonna go back to white balance and drop it by around 2 or 3 hundredths. And that should take care of the yellowness that was around here. But I'm still not happy with how the clouds look, so I'm gonna push it a bit further and see what happens. I think I like it a bit more like this, but only in the clouds part, and the rest of the photo is getting way too dull. So instead, I'm gonna use, let's see, can I do it with a sky mask? Will it be able to select the sky properly? Not bad. Let's subtract from it a linear gradient because I don't want it affecting the flare over here. And now let's drop the temperature just in the sky on the left part of the image. And I'm gonna subtract another linear gradient from it on the bottom part. And actually, I'm going to duplicate this mask, reset the white balance, and intersect it with another linear gradient because I want the horizon line over here to be a bit lighter. So what I'm gonna do is create a mask that's basically just covering the bottom part of the sky. Pretty large gradient, so it's not really obvious. And I'm increasing the exposure by just a bit. I'm also gonna move this gradient a bit so it's not that obvious behind of my subject. And I think that's about it with the sky. Maybe it's quite a bit too saturated, so I'm gonna drop the saturation a little bit as well. And with all this blue, now I want to turn my attention to the yellow side of things because they now seem undersaturated because of how saturated the blue sky is. And honestly, I want the entire image to look punchy, saturated, and really bold. So let's see. How are we doing with vibrance? Just plus 30, maybe a bit more. I'm also going to increase the saturation a tiny bit as well. Not bad. And what I want now is some reddish where the highlights fade around here. And I'm also concerned a bit about the skin tones of my subject face, especially in the shadowy parts. I think it's going a bit into green, and I definitely don't want skin to look green in my final photos. So let's see. In the first mask, can I add a bit more magenta and a bit more warmth to his head? Yep, works perfectly. And now let's see if I can take care of the flare being way too yellow and going into green by just playing around with the calibration panel. This is really affecting his skin tones, so nope. This is dulling down the flare, so I'm gonna resort to HSL. And when this doesn't work as well, let's go back to masking. Radial gradient, trying to make it as big as the actual flare with quite a small feather. Invert it. I'm gonna subtract the linear gradient from it for the left side. And over here, it's pretty good. I want to make it just a bit bigger. So since it's inverted, I'm actually making the circle a bit smaller. And now I can inject some magenta into it. And I think I'm also going to increase the saturation, see how it looks. I don't like it because of the hue, so let's play around with the hue slider and make it a bit more orangey. And I want it to affect the grass as well. So I'm gonna go with a brush on the same mask and just lightly touch on the grass. And I'm also going to come on this other side and add the same tones on the yellow zone, so the image looks cohesive. Maybe erase my mask a bit here. And also let's increase the contrast in the flare. Maybe we can enhance the effect a bit more. I like where this is going, but what I don't like is the lack of contrast on his face. So let's come in here and see what happens if I increase the clarity, the texture, and the contrast on the mask that I've previously made, selecting just the subject, and it's intersected with the radial gradient, I think. So it's affecting just the upper part of his body. Maybe if I move the radial gradient a bit around, I'll get a much better result. Because I know this mask is lifting the highlights, I don't really want to affect the lower part of his body that much. So let's make it smaller and make sure it's affecting just the face. And I think I'm resorting to curves. Let's drop a point on the highlights over here and drop the shadows a bit, increase the bright side a bit more. And that's a pretty nice contrast, maybe a bit too much contrast in the lower part of the image. So let's see, can I increase the blacks just a tiny bit more and have it look nice? And there's one more thing that I want to take care with a mask, and that's gonna be a radial gradient on the bottom part over here, affecting the shadow pretty much, where I want to drop the contrast because I think it's getting a bit too dark. And with the edit pretty much done, I think now would be a good time for me to explain some of the tools that I'm using in this video for the people who are not familiar with my Lightroom tools. The all-in-one grain preset is a tool that I created to emulate the way grain behaves on actual film compared to the usual grain stuff in Lightroom, which is pretty uniform. My presets are actually applying 4 different masks to your image. They are targeting the highlights, midtones, and the shadows separately, applying different amount of grain, and also taking down the clarity and the sharpness a bit to mimic the way actual film looks, where the shadows have a bit less detail and a lot less grain. And finally, there's the grain limiter on top of all those masks, which is reducing the amount of grain just a bit, because at the ends of the spectrum, you shouldn't see quite a lot of grain. And another one that I really want to talk about are color response curves. There is an entire video detailing my technique of extracting the way film would look like and react to light from DaVinci Resolve LUTs and importing it into Lightroom as curves. And those curves can be baked into camera profiles, as you saw me using one in the beginning of this edit, and they also can be applied in the curves panel. But today I actually used it in a mask, and that's something that I'll talk about in the next video, because the Kodak 2383 pack on my website is gonna get a free upgrade. So you can buy it now and benefit from it later on. But let's go back to today's photo. This is the photo that I started with. And through Lightroom magic, this is my final photo. Let me know your opinion in the comments down below, and I really hope that you learned something from today's video. And if you did, make sure to hit subscribe.